1. The Forgotten Mask, A Carnival of Shadows. Ava was a costume designer with a passion for history. She often wandered estate sales and antique shops looking for unique pieces to add to her collection. One rainy afternoon, she stumbled upon an estate sale at a crumbling mansion on the outskirts of town. The items on the display were peculiar: worn-out instruments, faded theater posters, and vintage clothing. But what caught her eye was a Venetian mask sitting in an ornate glass case. It was stunning. Adorned with intricate filigree of gold and silver, but the eyes were what truly captivated her. They were blackened, hollow, and somehow full of sorrow. The estate's curator seemed hesitant when Ava asked about the mask. It belonged to Serafina Moretti, a famous opera singer, he said, glancing around as though expecting someone to overhear. She disappeared during her final performance. They say the mask is cursed, tied to whatever happened that night. Ava dismissed the story as superstition. She bought the mask, ignoring the uneasy looks the curator gave her. At home, Ava placed the mask on a pedestal in her workshop. It became her muse, inspiring sketches of elaborate costumes and stage designs. But strange things began to happen almost immediately. At night, she heard faint singing, a haunting melody in a language she didn't recognize. At first, she thought it was her neighbors, but the sound seemed to come from her own home, echoing softly through the halls. One night, she found the mask lying on the floor, though she was certain she had left it secure on its stand. Its hollow eyes seemed to follow her as she placed it back. That same night, she dreamed of an enormous opera house. The audience was shadowy, their faces blurred, and in the center of the stage stood a woman wearing the mask, singing a mournful aria. Her voice was beautiful yet unsettling, filled with a sorrow that lingered long after Ava woke. Unable to shake the dreams, Ava began researching Serafina Moretti. The deeper she dug, the darker the story became. Serafina had been a rising star, known for her stunning performances and her enigmatic beauty. During her final show, she had worn the mask for the first time, a gift from an unknown admirer. Witnesses claimed that as she sang the last notes of her aria, the theater went completely silent. When the lights returned, every member of the audience had vanished, leaving only the mask behind. Ava's unease grew, but she couldn't resist the mask's pull. It was as if it whispered to her, beckoning her to wear it. One night, overwhelmed by an almost supernatural compulsion, she placed it on her face. The moment the mask touched her skin, the world around her shifted. She was no longer in her workshop, but in the grand opera house from her dreams. The air was heavy with decay, the once ornate walls cracked and crumbling. Shadowy figures filled the seats, their faces voids of darkness. In the center of the stage, Ava felt herself drawn forward. She couldn't remove the mask. It clung to her face like a second skin. The shadows began to move, their applause a distorted hum that grew louder and louder. Ava tried to scream, but instead she sang the same haunting aria from her dreams. Her voice was not her own, carrying a sorrow so deep it felt as though it were ripping her apart. The figures rose from their seats, advancing toward her, their forms stretching and twisting unnaturally. The more she sang, the closer they came. When she awoke, she was back in her workshop, but something was wrong. The mask was gone from the pedestal, and her reflection in the mirror showed her face pale and drawn, as though she had aged decades overnight. Her voice, once vibrant, was now a hoarse whisper. The next morning, her neighbors found her house empty. The mask had returned to the estate sale, its filigree darker, its presence heavier, as if it had consumed another piece of its wearer. A new buyer, enchanted by its beauty, purchased it the same day. 2. The Clockmaker's curse, time runs out. Elias Tremaine was a master clockmaker, but his work was far from ordinary. His clocks were known not just for their precision, but for their unsettling designs. Carvings of anguished faces, twisted vines, and hands that seemed almost alive adorned his pieces. Locals whispered that Elias dabbled in the occult, channeling his obsession with time into his creations. When Elias disappeared one stormy night, leaving behind only a single, magnificent grandfather clock, the townsfolk were too frightened to claim it. Years later, the clock resurfaced at an estate auction, catching the eye of Marcus, a historian fascinated by dark artifacts. The clock was exquisite. Its face was marked not by numbers but by intricate symbols, its pendulum a gleaming obsidian shard. Marcus brought it home, intrigued by its strange beauty and the stories that surrounded it. From the moment the clock was installed in his study, Marcus noticed odd occurrences. At night, the clock ticked even when unwound, its chimes resonating at odd, irregular hours. He began to dream vividly, always of a vast, endless void where clocks floated in silence. Each dream ended with a voice whispering, "Your time is running out." One evening, as Marcus worked late, the clock struck midnight, though it had never been wound. The chime was deafening, shaking the very walls. When Marcus looked up, he saw something impossible. The figures carved into the clock's wood were moving. Tiny hands clawed at the edges, their anguished faces twisting in silent screams. The pendulum swung violently, casting eerie shadows across the room. Terrified, Marcus tried to move the clock, but it was as if it were bolted to the floor. The room grew colder, and the air became thick with a suffocating presence. Time itself seemed to warp. The second hand began spinning backward, and Marcus felt as though his body was being pulled apart. Desperate, Marcus smashed the glass casing with a nearby bookend, hoping to stop the clock. But as the shards fell, he saw his own reflection in the pendulum. His face was aged beyond recognition, his eyes hollow and filled with terror. The reflection smirked at him, mouthing the words, "Your time is mine." The next day, Marcus's house was found empty, the clock standing untouched in the corner. Its carvings had changed. Among the twisted faces there was now a new one, bearing a striking resemblance to Marcus, his mouth frozen mid-scream. 3. The Lake of Shadows, a drowning secret. In a quiet countryside town, surrounded by dense woods, lay a lake shrouded in superstition. Locals called it the Lake of Shadows, and for good reason. Dozens of people had vanished there over the years. Stories circulated about strange ripples on its surface when the water was calm, voices calling out from the depths, and shadowy figures lurking beneath the mirrored surface. Ellie, a photographer fascinated by folklore, decided to visit the lake, hoping to capture its eerie beauty. She had heard the warnings: don't stay past sunset, don't look into the water too long. But she dismissed them as small-town myths, perfect material for her blog. She arrived in the late afternoon, setting up her camera near the edge of the lake. The scenery was breathtaking. Crystal clear waters surrounded by towering pine trees and blanketed by an almost unnatural silence. As Ellie began snapping photos, she noticed something peculiar. The reflection of the trees in the water seemed off. Their shapes were warped, almost claw-like, as if the water held a world of its own. As she adjusted her lens, she thought she saw movement beneath the surface, a dark, shadowy shape that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. Intrigued, Ellie leaned closer to the water. That's when she heard it, a faint, melodic voice whispering her name. She froze. The voice was soft, almost pleading, and seemed to echo from the center of the lake. Against her better judgment, Ellie stepped closer, her boots sinking slightly into the muddy shore. Suddenly, the voice grew louder, more insistent. She stumbled back, her heart racing, but the surface of the lake remained calm, as if mocking her fear. Shaking her head, Ellie decided it was time to leave. As she packed her equipment, she glanced back at the water and saw something that made her blood run cold. Her own reflection was still staring at the lake, even though she had turned away. Panicking, Ellie sprinted to her car, but as she started the engine, she realized the forest had grown unnaturally dark. The road back to town seemed endless, the trees pressing in from both sides. The radio crackled with static, and through the noise, she heard the same melodic voice calling her name, clearer now, almost in her ear. When she finally reached her hotel, she locked the door and collapsed onto the bed. But her relief was short-lived. The whispers followed her, growing louder in the silence of her room. In the bathroom mirror, she saw her reflection again, but it wasn't her. The figure in the glass wore her face, but stared with hollow black eyes, its mouth moving as if speaking words she couldn't hear. The next morning, Ellie was gone. Her car was found abandoned near the lake, her equipment scattered along the shore. Locals avoided the area, whispering that the lake had claimed another soul. Weeks later, a new ripple appeared on the water's surface, and if you listened closely, you could hear her voice joining the others, calling out for the next visitor. 4. The Silent Boarding School, Lessons in Fear. Hidden deep in the English countryside was an abandoned boarding school known as Ashmore Academy. The school had been closed for decades after a tragedy that no one liked to talk about. Locals claimed it was haunted by the ghosts of its students, their laughter replaced by whispers that echoed through the empty halls. Sophie, a paranormal investigator, decided to explore the school for her channel. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a recorder, she ventured inside late one night. The building was a decaying labyrinth of broken desks, shattered windows, and faded murals of children playing. At first, the only sounds were the crunch of her boots on debris and the distant hoot of an owl. As she ventured deeper, Sophie noticed strange things: a chalkboard with fresh writing that hadn't been there moments before, faint giggles that seemed to come from just around the corner, and the distinct feeling of being watched. In one classroom, she found rows of tiny desks, each holding an open notebook. The pages were filled with jagged handwriting that simply read, "Stay with us." Her flashlight flickered, and for a split second, she saw shadowy figures seated at the desks. They were children, their faces pale and lifeless, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Sophie froze, her breath catching in her throat. When the light steadied, the desks were empty again. She tried to leave, but the halls seemed to twist and change, leading her in circles. The whispers grew louder, turning into a chorus of laughter and screams. A shadowy figure emerged at the end of the hallway, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a cane. He pointed toward her, and the whispers stopped. In the silence, Sophie heard a single word. "Rah!" She sprinted toward what she hoped was the exit, the man's footsteps echoing behind her. Just as she reached the front door, it slammed shut, locking her inside. The last thing her camera recorded was her flashlight dropping to the floor, illuminating dozens of tiny footprints that surrounded her. The next day, Sophie's equipment was found on the steps of the school, but she was nowhere to be seen. Locals claimed that at night you could hear her voice among the whispers, calling out for help. 5. The Phantom's Lantern, a tale of the railway. In the late 1800s, a tragic accident occurred on the Black Ridge Railway line. A train derailed on a misty night, plunging into the ravine below. Dozens of passengers perished, and the conductor, known only as Henry, was never found. Legends say his spirit roams the tracks, carrying a lantern to guide lost souls or claim them. Sam, an urban explorer, had heard the stories and decided to investigate. On a foggy night, he ventured to the abandoned railway with a group of friends. The tracks were overgrown with weeds, the air thick with moisture, and an eerie stillness. They laughed nervously, daring each other to call out for the conductor. As they walked, a faint light appeared in the distance, a single lantern swinging back and forth. At first, they thought it was another explorer, but the light moved too smoothly, too purposefully. It grew brighter, revealing the silhouette of a man in a conductor's uniform. His face was obscured by the fog, but his presence radiated cold dread. The friends decided to turn back, but the track seemed endless, stretching further no matter how far they walked. The lantern appeared again, closer this time, its light illuminating their terrified faces. They heard faint whispers, followed by the screeching sound of an invisible train barreling toward them. One by one, the group vanished, their screams drowned out by the phantom train's roar. Sam was the last to remain, paralyzed as the conductor's figure approached. The lantern's light engulfed him, and everything went dark. The next morning, locals found the tracks empty, except for Sam's flashlight and a single lantern, still glowing faintly. Those brave enough to walk the railway at night claim they hear the sound of wheels and a distant voice calling passengers to board the ghost train.